This is the FS5 Mark I. This is most likely not the camera that you want to get in 2023. But I decided to try it out anyway. Allow me to share with you what a camera like this has to offer, what you really want out of a camera like this, and my experience while shooting with this camera. Let's begin, shall we? Hey fam, mga kapatid, welcome back to the channel. So I was scrolling around eBay and saw this guy, the Sony FS5. I know there's a Sony FX6, but what is this FS5? Oh, it's a crop sensor camera. Perfect. I just switched back over to Super 35mm and sold my full frame lenses. For a camera that originally sold for $5,600 back in November 2015, it can't be that outdated in 2023, right? You see, I thought it would be a good idea to make this my studio camera for all this A-roll and talking head to shoot cinematic vlogs and maybe even take this to the church to get better footage than the camcorder that we have there. And this is where we start to learn more about the camera. It's got excellent ergonomics and form factor. It's made out of a magnesium body and it weighs 1.77 pounds or about 803 grams. I mean, my FX30 is 1.42 pounds or 646 grams. The FS5 was made to be smaller than its older brother, the FS7, and I love everything about the ergonomics of this camera. We got controls on the left side of the camera here that help control audio, variable ND, iris, ISO, picture profiles, and S&Q mode. It's also got adjustable grip for the right hand that also has two function buttons, a scroll wheel, and record button. And literally on top is the handle that has a record button, a hot shoe, cold shoe, XLR port, a shotgun microphone holder, and additional mounting points for the LCD screen. We don't just have one XLR port, by the way, but we also have another one on the body. Nice, eh? Coming back over to the left side of the camera, we got a knob for variable ND. They say once you go variable ND, it's hard to go back. After using this, man, it's just a pleasure to leave this thing in auto. Yet, also have the option to have a smooth variable ND. Magic. Another reason to appreciate this camera is that it uses SD cards. Not them more expensive XQD cards. I don't even have to worry about shooting more expensive SD cards either that are like V60 or V90. Slow motion. Also, did I mention that you can shoot up to 960 frames per second in slow motion in 1080p? Well, mostly it's usable around 240 frames per second at 1080p. And no, there's no 4K 60 frames per second internally. But hey, we got slow motion, raw SDI output, the single feature that future-proofs this camera. Internally, you have room for color grading in 1080p with 10-bit, but if you're outputting your footage to an Atomos Shogun or Ninja V+, you can unlock 12-bit raw, after you make all the purchases of course. But you can also shoot ProRes RAW through an Atomos recorder through the HDMI port. Just don't expect 12-bit raw. For the battery, we have the Sony BPU30, which runs for approximately 130 minutes. You can still get the BPU90 and still maintain a lighter camera package without having to rig up a V-mount battery or something. Shutter angle. When it comes to internal features of this camera, this is just a pleasure to have. Instead of having to manually change my shutter speed, the camera already adjusts accordingly based on the 180-degree rule. You get the shutter angle on auto to 180 degrees. You got the variable ND to set to auto for 1.5 stops over. The ISO set for native ISO of 2000 for S-Log3 and S-Log2. You practically only have to worry about lighting, aperture, and, well, focus. According to world-renowned cinematographer Alistair Chapman, this camera, the FS5, is not a cinema camera, but it is a running gun camera. And I thought, that sounds like the camera for me. But as someone who is more often in front of the camera lately, I start to find out that this camera probably isn't for me, as I start to feel the limitations, but more on that later. After using this camera for a while alongside my FX30, I started to shoot differently. I'm exploring how it means to shoot at the base ISO, shoot with the most dynamic range possible on a camera, even if I have to use a variable ND indoors. I noticed how the FX30 uses Cine EI with the native ISOs of 800 and 2500, but the FS5 only has one for the S-Log2, and that's 2000. Nonetheless, the footage was able to match pretty good in color correcting, even when I used S-Log3. It wasn't until much later on that I found out that S-Log2 is a much better picture profile for this camera. On top of that, this camera made me shoot more manual focus. I did have the Sony 18-105 f4, which just so happens to be the original kit lens that is paired with this camera. But since the focus was fly-by-wire, it was just a bit too sensitive for me. So much that I ended up using my Sigma 30mm f1.4 instead. When comparing this camera to the FX30, after you get past all the ergonomics of the FS5, you start to feel overwhelmed. Yes, there's 10-bit in the FS5, but only in 1080. When it comes to 4K, we are limited to 8-bit colors. You're not going color crazy on this footage, definitely not as much flexibility as many would like nowadays. Also, people have mentioned that the 4K is much softer than the 1080p. I haven't noticed much of a difference, especially on cell phone screens. However, when I did switch from 1080p to 4K recording, I did notice my focus peaking get smaller and sometimes even disappear from my LCD screen and monitor. As I mentioned earlier, the native ISO for S-Log2 and 3 is ISO 2000. Even after you expose correctly, you will notice that there is still a decent amount of grain in here, more than many shooting full frame are uncomfortable with. With this older sensor, you can't expect to be flexible in your shadows and blacks. You just have to expose correctly to reduce the noise. And since it's an older Sony sensor, you have to expose for 1 to 1.5 stops of light to maximize our dynamic range. Aside from this, autofocus is reliable. Kinda. Yes, this has autofocus on it, but you can't change its focusing speed, so you really only got manual focus. If you're doing a talking head, yes, we can use face detect autofocus. It'll show the box around you, but as soon as you start talking with your hands, oh, that thing will bob and weave. Box you out, kapatid. I did use this camera as an A-cam for one of my tutorials, and while scrubbing through the footage, I saw that the camera was focusing in and out of the background. The only way the focus will stick to me is if I leave this in manual mode. Bit rates for this camera are low. Unless we're recording RAW, we're shooting 1080p at 50 megabytes per second and 4K up to 100 megabytes per second. For me, that's fine. But for more serious shooters beyond YouTube or even after high quality YouTube videos, you'll want more than this. On top of the base price of this camera, you still need to spend up to $1,647 for upgrades to shoot RAW at 4K 60 and continuous 2K at 240 frames or 200 frames per second. Then 1080p at continuous 120 frames per second for slow motion, and shoot 1080 at 422 and 420. The FS5 Mark II already gives you the option to shoot RAW externally and shoot 1080 at 120 frames per second. And you're probably going to spend another $700 to $1,000 just to buy the Adamus recorder to record 12-bit RAW on. Another thing to consider is that although this is a low profile form factor compared to the FS7, it's still not consumer looking either. I wasn't approached at the park this winter season when shooting with this, but it still makes me worry that people are going to give me a problem shooting with this thing because I may just need a permit, even if it's not for commercial use. Let me know, what is your dream camera? As good as the FS5 was back in 2015, it was for people who wanted to eventually work their way up to the FS7 or now the FX9. Today, that can still be the same if you're the one who's mostly behind the camera. If you're mostly shooting 1080p, maybe mounting some full frame Canon EF glass on here with a speed booster, and maybe spending another $1,000 or so just to shoot 12-bit ProRes RAW. Before you even do that, also consider the FS5 Mark II, which also comes with most of the upgrades that this one will charge you for. This camera isn't all bad news though, but in some way or another, it's gonna make you learn today. For my style of shooting, the FX30 is still the camera for me. It's compact, has amazing autofocus, and with internal features that are more like the cinema cameras of today, like the FX6 and the FX9 with S-Cinetone, Cine EI, but instead of having variable NDs, has IBIS. I wish it did have internal NDs, but it's okay. After picking up the FS5 and letting it back into the market, well, will be back in the market, there's still a hole in my heart. I don't know why, but in some way, I enjoyed this camera. It made me feel like a pro videographer, like a filmmaker. But to be completely honest with myself, the FX30 is still the perfect camera for me for what I do. I'm shooting YouTube videos, personal cinematic vlogs, and photos. It does everything I need to do perfectly for this YouTube channel, for my perfect use, and even for professional use when called upon. I'm happy with that. If you think you'll pick up a camera like this or want to learn more about it, I'll leave links in the description for you to check out. Meanwhile, I've got sample footage from the FS5 over here, but you can also check out videos I made about the FX30 over here. Thanks again for watching. Now go out there and shoot for the life that matters. See ya. Man, I hope that in just a couple more years, the FX6 will be just as affordable as the FS5 now. I would definitely get that instead though.